September 25th, 1396. The sky above the Danube plain is the color of cold iron. A chill has settled into the river valley through the night, and now, in the hour before dawn, the last great army of Christendom stirs in its camp. Fires are being stoked, armor is being buckled, war horses are stamping on frost-hard ground, their breath rising in white plumes that dissolve into the gray dark. From a distance, the Crusader camp might look like a festival, the banners of a dozen nations snapping in the morning wind, the gleam of polished plate catching the first pale suggestion of light on the eastern horizon. France is here. Burgundy is here. Hungary, England, the Knights of St. John, Venice, the Holy Roman Empire, all of them, gathered on the banks of the Danube in a valley called Nicopolis, certain that God is on their side. But certainty is a dangerous thing in war, and the men who built their camp on that plain, who feasted the night before, and laughed at the idea that any army on earth could stop them, are about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. On the ridge above them, concealed in the broken hills and behind a screen of cavalry that stretches as far as the eye can see, waits Sultan Bayezid I of the Ottoman Empire, a man his enemies have already learned to call the Thunderbolt. He has marched here from Constantinople in 7 days. 7 days, with an army of tens of thousands.
Attack them now.
He has done this before,
Victory.
2 kingdoms that no longer exist. And unlike the knights below him, he has not come to win glory. He has come to finish something. The Crusaders number perhaps 16,000 fighting men, maybe more. They are the finest warriors Christian Europe can field, knights in the fullest flower of medieval chivalry, trained from boyhood to charge, to fight, to break any enemy line. They have ridden here from across the continent, fired by papal blessing and by the intoxicating belief that this campaign, this last great crusade, will drive the Ottomans back from the gates of Europe and save Constantinople from the siege that has strangled it for years. The Ottomans number somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000, depending on whose account you trust. The disparity in those estimates doesn't matter much. What matters is that the Crusaders don't know the true size of what they're facing. What matters is that Bayezid has placed his best troops, his disciplined, battle-hardened Janissaries, his ferocious Sipahi cavalry, his Serbian vassal allies who know exactly how European knights fight, behind a ridge that the Crusaders cannot see over. The trap is already set. The door is already closed. The Crusaders just haven't realized it yet. This is the Battle of Nicopolis, the last great crusade. And by sunset on September 25th, 1396, it will be over. Not in triumph, but in catastrophe. Thousands will die. Thousands more will be executed on the banks of the Danube in one of the most shocking massacres in crusading history. And the dream of a Christian counteroffensive that would push the Ottomans back into Asia will die with them, never to truly revive again. The story of Nicopolis is not a simple story of good versus evil, of the faithful against the infidel. It is something far more uncomfortable than that. It is the story of how arrogance became a weapon, how an army's absolute certainty in its own invincibility became the very thing that destroyed it. It is the story of a civilization that chose pride over strategy, glory over survival, and paid for that choice in blood. And it is the story of a sultan who knew exactly what his enemies would do and let them do it. Character 1. The world before Nicopolis. To understand the catastrophe of Nicopolis, you have to understand the world that produced it. You have to understand how the Ottoman Empire was built, why it frightened Europe so deeply, and why that fear, paradoxically, made the Crusaders so reckless. For most of its early history, the Ottoman state was one principality among many in the shattered landscape of post-Mongol Anatolia. When the great Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan fractured in the late 13th century, it left behind a chaos of competing Turkish princes, each fighting for control of the former Byzantine frontier territories in Western Asia Minor. The Ottomans were not the strongest of these princes. They were not the richest, nor the most established, nor the most feared. What they had was something more durable than strength. They had a system. Osman, the founder of the dynasty, understood that a state built on plunder would eventually collapse when the plunder ran out. So he built something different, a professional military class bound by loyalty to the dynasty, a bureaucracy capable of administering conquered territory, and a policy of religious tolerance that kept the diverse populations of his expanding domain broadly content. His successors refined and extended this system, generation by generation, until the Ottoman Empire had become something medieval Europe had no category for, a military state that was also a functioning civilization. By the time Murad I came to the throne in 1362, the Ottomans had crossed from Asia into Europe and were systematically dismantling the Christian kingdoms of the Balkans. Thrace fell, Macedonia fell, Bulgaria fell. In 1389, at a field called Kosovo-Polje, the Ottoman army met the combined forces of a Balkan Christian coalition led by the Serbian prince Lazar, and in a battle that both sides would later mythologize almost beyond recognition, they destroyed it. The Serbian state never recovered. Lazar died on the field, and Murad himself was killed, stabbed, according to legend, by a Serbian noble who penetrated the Ottoman lines pretending to be a deserter. Murad's death was significant, but it did not slow the Ottoman advance for a single day. His son Bayezid was acclaimed sultan on the battlefield itself, reportedly while Murad's body was still warm. And Bayezid, from the very first hour of his reign, made clear that he intended not merely to continue his father's work, but to accelerate it. The name Yildirim means the Thunderbolt in Turkish. Bayezid earned it not through a single spectacular victory, but through the sheer velocity of his campaigning. He moved faster than any commander his contemporaries had encountered. He appeared where he was not expected. He struck before his enemies had finished assembling. In the years following Kosovo, he swept through Bulgaria, reduced the remaining Byzantine territories to a narrow strip around Constantinople, and began the long siege of the city that would, eventually, become the defining geopolitical fact of the late medieval Eastern Mediterranean. But Bayezid was not merely a hammer. He was also a strategist of considerable sophistication. He understood the political fragmentation of Europe. He understood that the Christian kingdoms to his west were rivals as much as allies, that the French and the Hungarians distrusted each other, that the Venetians placed trade above faith, that the German princes were perpetually absorbed in their own quarrels. He understood, in short, that the crusading impulse, the idea that Christian Europe could unite against a common enemy, was an idea that rarely survived contact with political reality. And so when news reached him in 1395 that Pope Boniface IX had issued a crusading bull, and that King Sigismund of Hungary was assembling the largest Christian army in decades, Bayezid did not panic. He assessed, he calculated, and then he waited. Sigismund of Hungary was, in many ways, the ideal man to lead the defense of Christendom against the Ottoman threat. He was pragmatic, experienced, and genuinely afraid, not in the cowardly sense, but in the strategically useful sense. He had watched the Ottoman advance from close range for years. He had lost men to Bayezid's raids. He knew how Ottoman armies fought, knew their discipline and their patience, knew that they were not the disorganized horde that many Western Europeans imagined when they thought of Eastern enemies. He asked for a crusade not because he expected a glorious triumph, but because he needed help, and a crusade was the only mechanism that could deliver enough men to matter. What he got was not quite what he needed. When the call went out across Western Europe, it was answered with enormous enthusiasm. But the enthusiasm was not Sigismund's. It belonged to the French. King Charles VI of France, himself increasingly lost to the mental illness that would shadow his entire reign, blessed the expedition and sent with it the finest of his kingdom's young nobility. At the head of the French contingent rode John of Nevers, son of the Duke of Burgundy, 24 years old, handsome, wealthy, and burning with a desire for military glory that his youth had not yet had the chance to satisfy. With him came some of the most illustrious names in French chivalry: the Marshal Boucicaut, the Constable of France, the Count of Eu, men whose armor was the finest that Parisian craftsmen could produce, and whose confidence in their own invincibility was absolute. They were, in the language of their own culture, the flower of Christian knighthood. In the more practical language of military history, they were a serious tactical problem. Not because they lacked courage, they had courage in abundance, possibly too much, but because their entire conception of warfare was built around a single act, the charge. The massed cavalry charge of heavily armored knights had been the decisive weapon in European warfare for 3 centuries. It was what French knights trained for, dreamed of, and defined themselves by. Against the right enemy in the right conditions, it was devastating. Against a prepared Ottoman army on ground of the Ottomans' choosing, it was something else entirely. Sigismund knew this. From the moment the crusading army assembled at Buda in the summer of 1396, he tried to make the French understand. He proposed a strategy of caution. Let the Ottoman cavalry come, absorb its attack from behind a defensive line, then counterattack from a position of strength. It was the strategy of a man who had studied his enemy. The French found it contemptible. They had not come all this way to stand on the defensive. They had come to charge. The distance between these two men, Sigismund the strategist and Nevers the romantic, was not merely personal. It was civilizational. It represented 2 entirely different answers to the same question. What is war for? For Sigismund, war was a grim instrument of state, to be used as precisely and economically as possible, because men and money were finite, and the Ottoman Empire was not going away. For Nevers and the French knights, war was something else entirely. It was a theater of honor, a proving ground for the values that defined their class. You did not win honor by waiting behind a defensive line. You won it by charging, by the pure physical act of putting your horse at a gallop and driving into the enemy and either destroying him or dying in the attempt. The distinction between those 2 outcomes was, in a sense, secondary. What mattered was the charge itself, the pursuit of courage, the demonstration of the qualities that made a knight a knight. These were not stupid men. Many of the French commanders were politically sophisticated, culturally accomplished, personally courageous in ways that went well beyond simple aggression. But their entire military framework had been built around the cavalry charge, and they had never encountered an enemy who had studied that framework and designed a battlefield specifically to destroy it. They were, in the precise military sense, meeting something new, and their response to novelty was to reach for what they knew. The army that marched south along the Danube that summer was a magnificent and deeply divided force. Perhaps 16,000 fighting men in total, plus a fleet of Venetian and Hospitaller ships on the river. The French and Burgundian knights, perhaps 10,000 strong, marched at the front, certain of their precedence. Behind them came Sigismund's Hungarians, the Transylvanians, the Wallachians under their Prince Murzia, and contingents of Germans, English Hospitaller knights, and others. It should have been the most powerful crusading army in living memory. It was, instead, a coalition on the verge of fracturing under the weight of its own internal conflicts. They moved south, and as they moved, they paused to take the town of Rahova by force, slaughtering the garrison and much of the population in a display of violence that would have consequences none of them anticipated. They arrived before the walls of Nicopolis, a Bulgarian fortress town on the southern bank of the Danube, in mid-September, and laid siege to it. And there they stayed, feasting and quarreling and waiting, while Bayezid's scouts watched from the hills. Character 2. The trap is set. Nicopolis sits on a bluff above the Danube, its walls commanding a wide view of the river and the surrounding plain. In 1396, it was a well-fortified Ottoman garrison town, not enormous, but substantial enough to require a proper siege rather than a quick assault. The Crusaders had artillery, some of the finest cannons that Western Europe could provide, but the logistics of siege warfare required patience, and patience was not the French contingent's strong suit. The terrain around Nicopolis was deceptive. From the Crusader camp on the plain below the town, The ground appeared to slope gently upward toward a series of low ridges to the south. What the Crusaders could not see, and made no serious effort to reconnoiter, was what lay beyond those ridges. The hills were broken and wooded, crossed by narrow valleys that an army could move through without being observed from the plain. An experienced commander, or a paranoid one, would have sent cavalry scouts into that terrain as a matter of course. The French commanders were neither experienced nor paranoid. They were confident. The Crusader army had certain strengths that were real and considerable. The French knights were, individually, among the best-trained heavy cavalry in the world. Their horses were war-bred destriers, massive animals trained to charge into noise and chaos without flinching. Their armor was the product of generations of metalworking refinement, flexible enough for mounted combat, strong enough to stop most arrows and many, many sword blows. In a straight charge on open ground against a lightly armored enemy, they were nearly unstoppable. The Hungarians brought something different and in many ways complementary: experience. Sigismund's cavalry had been fighting Ottoman raiders for years along the Danube frontier, and they had developed tactics suited to that specific enemy. They understood feigned retreats. They understood how Ottoman Sipahi cavalry operated, the probing attacks, the apparent withdrawals that were actually baits. They had paid for that understanding in blood, crossed dozens of smaller engagements that left no mark in Western chronicles, but carved deep, deep lessons into the memories of the men who survived them. The Hospitallers, under their Grand Master Philibert de Naillac, brought professional discipline of a different kind. The institutional knowledge of a military religious order that had been fighting wars in the Eastern Mediterranean for 2 centuries. They had fortresses and roads. They had intelligence networks. They had, more than perhaps anyone else in the crusading army, a realistic sense of Ottoman military capability. De Naillac tried, in the councils of war, to reinforce Sigismund's caution. The French found him as easy to dismiss as the Hungarian king. The Venetian fleet provided crucial logistical support, supplies, and the possibility of escape along the river. But Venice was not a land power, and its crews were not fighters in the sense that counted at Nicopolis. They would prove valuable only for what came after. But the Ottoman army arrayed against them was not a lightly armored enemy, and Bayezid had no intention of allowing anything like a straight charge on open ground. When Bayezid arrived at Nicopolis, and he arrived with a speed that genuinely shocked the Crusaders, who had not believed he could march from Constantinople so quickly, he deployed his forces with characteristic precision. He understood exactly what the Crusaders would do, because the behavior of French heavy cavalry was almost perfectly predictable. They would charge. Uphill, downhill, into prepared positions, it didn't matter. When the moment came, they would charge. So Bayezid arranged his entire battle plan around that certainty. In the front of his position, he placed his azabs, irregular infantry, relatively lightly armored, and armed with stakes that they drove into the ground in rows across the upper slope of the approach. These stakes were the first trap. A charging knight who hit a line of stakes at full speed was not killed cleanly. He was thrown, his horse impaled or broken, the momentum of the charge converted in an instant from terrifying force into chaos and screaming. Behind the Azab infantry stood his Sipahi cavalry, the armored horsemen who formed the striking force of the Ottoman army. And behind the ridge, hidden from any view from the plain below, stood the core of Bayezid's power, his janissaries, the elite infantry who had never, in living memory, broken in battle. And with them, Bayezid's Serbian vassal cavalry, led by Stefan Lazarevic, son of the same Prince Lazar who had died at Kosovo. Men who knew exactly how crusading armies fought, because they had been fighting crusaders, and then fighting alongside them, and then fighting against them again for a generation. Bayezid also had one additional strategic asset that the crusaders did not fully appreciate. He had the siege of Nicopolis. The garrison inside the walls could not be relieved until the Ottoman field army was defeated, which meant that as long as Bayezid waited, the crusaders had to come to him. He did not need to attack. He only needed to be present and patient and allow the Crusaders' own urgency to drive them uphill into his prepared position. The night before the battle was different things to different men. In the French camp, there was feasting. John of Nevers had brought luxuries from Burgundy, wine, spices, the accoutrements of aristocratic life on campaign. The great nobles drank and talked about the glory of the coming day. They spoke of the charge they would make in the morning, of the honors that would be won, of how future generations would remember them. There was no serious tactical planning, because in their conception of battle, there was nothing to plan. You formed your line, you charged, you won. The details were for common soldiers to worry about. In Sigismund's camp, a different atmosphere prevailed. The Hungarian king did not sleep well. He had received reports from scouts that the Ottoman force was larger than anyone had estimated, that the terrain beyond the ridge concealed reserves that could not be counted. He called a council of war and proposed, again, the strategy of waiting behind a defensive line. And again, the French refused. The Count of Eu reportedly said, with the casual contempt of a man who cannot imagine being wrong, that Sigismund wanted to reserve the glory for his own Hungarians. It was an insult dressed as a military objection, and it ended the debate. Sigismund returned to his tent and lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of the French camp celebrating, and he understood, he must have understood, that tomorrow would not go as the French intended. What he could not know was exactly how complete the catastrophe would be. The Ottoman camp, by contrast, was quiet. Bayezid did not feast. He reviewed his positions one final time, satisfied that his trap was properly constructed, and then he slept. He had already won. He just needed the morning to prove it. Dawn came cold and gray over the Danube Valley. Men rose and armed themselves and looked toward the ridge above, and for a moment, just a moment, the plain was still. The two greatest armies of the age stood facing each other across a few miles of rolling ground, and the silence was the silence of something enormous, drawing its breath before it spoke. Then the drums began. Character 3. The Battle Phase 1. The Charge. The French moved first. Of course they moved first. John of Nevers and his fellow commanders had barely finished their morning prayers before the order went through the cavalry lines. Form up. Advance. The great destriers were brought forward, stamping and blowing, and the knights swung into their saddles with the practiced ease of men who had spent their entire lives being dressed for war. Visors came down, lances were couched. The pennants of 100 noble houses caught the morning breeze and snapped taut. Sigismund watched from the Hungarian lines and sent a final, desperate message to the French commanders. Wait. Let the infantry go first to deal with the stakes. Wait for the Hungarians to take their position on the flanks. Wait. Fight as an army, not as a mob of heroes. The message was ignored. The French cavalry moved up the slope in a line that stretched perhaps half a mile across. From below, it must have been an extraordinary sight. The flower of European chivalry in full armor, moving at a walk, then a trot, then a canter, the sound building from a rumble to a thunder as thousands of armored hooves struck the frost-hard ground. The battle cries rose, the banners streamed. This was what they had trained for since boyhood. This was the moment. The Azab infantry at the top of the slope watched them come and held their ground. These were not men who frightened easily. They were professional soldiers in the service of the most powerful military state in the world, and they had been told to do a job. Their job was to absorb the charge long enough for the real battle to begin. They raised their shields. They steadied themselves behind their stakes, and they waited. The impact, when it came, was brutal on both sides. The first French knights hit the Azab lines at something close to full speed, and the results were exactly what those stakes were designed to produce. Horses impaled themselves on the sharpened wood and went down screaming. Riders were thrown, their momentum carrying them forward into the Ottoman infantry,
where the ground fighting was immediate and savage and close. The Azabs were outmatched in individual combat with armored knights. They knew this. But individual combat was not the point. The point was chaos. The point was to break the charge's coherence, to fragment the line, to force the great war machine of the French cavalry to fight on foot in a press of bodies where all that beautiful armor became as much a burden as a protection. But the French outnumbered the Azabs, and courage, whatever else might be said about the French knights, they had in enormous quantity. They pushed through the stake lines. They pushed through the Azab infantry, taking losses they hadn't expected but taking them anyway, driving forward with the absolute conviction that if you only pushed hard enough, everything would give way. And the Azabs, having done their job, began to fall back, slowly, in good order, drawing the French knights up the slope and away from their supporting infantry, away from Sigismund's Hungarians, further and further into ground that Bayezid had chosen. The charge had succeeded in the narrow sense that the French knights had broken through the first Ottoman line, but they had paid for it, and the slope above them showed no sign of ending. They were breathless, disordered, their horses blowing hard from the exertion of the uphill push. And as they crested what they thought was the final ridge, gasping with effort and exhilaration, they found themselves looking at something that stopped them cold. Phase 2. The Sipahi. The Sipahi cavalry materialized from the broken ground on either side of the French advance, as if the earth had produced them. Thousands of armored horsemen, fresh, disciplined, moving in coordinated formation. They swept in from the flanks before the French could reform, before the disordered knights could turn their blown horses and face the new threat. The sound of the impact was enormous. The screaming of horses, the crack of lances, the grinding clatter of steel on steel. It filled the valley like weather. The French found themselves in a situation that their entire tactical tradition had had no answer for. They had been taught to attack, not to defend. They had been taught that the charge was the answer to everything. But you cannot charge in 3 directions at once. You cannot charge when your horse is exhausted and your formation is broken, and the enemy is coming from the flanks and the front simultaneously, and the ground beneath you is uneven, and the men around you are falling. For a time, and it must have felt like a very long time to the men inside it, the French knights fought with extraordinary ferocity. Individual acts of courage multiplied across the field. The Marshal Boucicaut, one of the most experienced soldiers in the French army, attempted to rally his men and establish a defensive formation. The Count of Eu fought his way through 3 separate Ottoman charges before he was finally pulled from his horse. John of Nevers himself, fighting in the middle of the line, cut down several opponents before the reality of the situation became undeniable. They were undeniable. They were losing. Not gradually, not narrowly. They were losing completely. The Sipahi cavalry was too numerous and too fresh, and the French knights were isolated from any support. Behind them, the Azab infantry had reformed and was advancing again. On the flanks, the Ottoman horsemen were closing the gap, and still the French could not see what lay beyond the ridge above them. But Bayezid could. He watched the battle from his position on the high ground, and when he judged that the French cavalry was sufficiently committed, far enough from any possible support, tired enough that their horses would not answer a burst of speed, disordered enough that coordinated resistance was impossible, he sent the signal. Phase 3. The Wall. Wall behind the ridge. They came over the ridge like a tide reversing. The Janissaries moved downhill in their characteristic silence, which was itself a weapon. Every army in the medieval world announced its attack with noise, drums, war cries, the clash of weapons on shield. The Janissaries were silent, and the silence was somehow worse than any sound. They wore uniform blue coats and moved in tight, deep formations, their composite bows sending a continuous rain of arrows into the French lines before they closed to sword range. These were men who had been taken as children from Christian villages across the Balkans, raised in Ottoman military schools, converted to Islam,
drilled from boyhood in the science of organized violence. They were, in the precise technical sense, a professional standing army, something Western Europe in 1396 essentially did not have. Their loyalty was absolute because their identity had been built entirely around their service. They had no farms to return to, no noble titles, no other life. They were soldiers. Soldiers, completely, in a way that even the most dedicated French knight was not. Behind them came Stefan Lazarevich's Serbian cavalry, knights as heavily armored as the French themselves, men who had watched their fathers fight at Kosovo and who had everything to prove. Stefan was 23 years old, almost exactly John of Navarre's age, and he was a formidable commander who combined genuine military talent with the bitter motivation of a man fighting to keep his family's vassalage productive. His cavalry wore the same full-plate armor as the French knights opposite them, wielded the same weapons, had trained in the same traditions. The difference was that they had crossed the ridge fresh, behind the concealment of Bayezid's prepared ground, and they knew exactly where they were going and what they were doing. The French, by the time the Janissaries appeared, did not. The French knights who had survived to this point now faced a fresh, disciplined army attacking them from above, a Sipahi cavalry attacking from the flanks, and Azab infantry blocking any retreat downhill. The trap had fully closed. There was nowhere to go. What happened next is one of the most devastating 15 minutes in the history of crusading warfare. The French line, already thinned and disordered by 2 previous engagements, simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. Knights who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of battle found themselves unable to fight. Not because they lacked skill or courage, but because courage and skill are tools, and tools require circumstances in which they can be applied. A charging knight in an open field is a terrible weapon. A dismounted knight on a crowded hillside, exhausted, surrounded, unable to see his comrades through the press of bodies, is just a man in heavy armor who is very tired. The slaughter was enormous. No one who witnessed it and survived forgot it. The prisoners taken in the aftermath would describe the scene in terms that their listeners, who had not been there, found almost impossible to credit. The bodies lay so thick on the upper slope that later accounts said you could not take a step without treading on the fallen. The screaming of wounded horses went on for hours. The pennants of France and Burgundy and a dozen other noble houses lay in the mud, trampled under the feet of Ottoman janissaries who collected them as trophies. Some of the French commanders were captured rather than killed. Their obvious wealth and status made them valuable. John of Navarre was taken alive. The Marshal Boucicaut was captured. The Count of Eu, already wounded from multiple engagements, surrendered when it became clear that resistance was impossible. They were pulled from the field and held under guard, their lives temporarily preserved by their financial value. Phase 4. The Hungarians fight alone. Sigismund had watched the French charge from his position on the plain, and he had known within minutes that it would end in disaster. The question now was whether anything could be salvaged. If the Hungarian army could hold the plain, could prevent Bayezid from following up his victory over the French with a full pursuit, then at least some part of the crusading force might survive to fight another day. The Hungarian army was still intact. Sigismund had kept it back, despite pressure from his own commanders who wanted to join the French advance. Now that restraint gave him something to fight with. He formed his lines, deployed his artillery, and prepared to receive the Ottoman advance. The battle on the plain was different from the catastrophe on the slope. The Hungarians fought well. They were experienced soldiers fighting in a formation suited to defensive warfare, and for a time, a bruising, desperate, costly time, they held. Bayezid's Sipahi cavalry tested the Hungarian lines repeatedly and was pushed back. The Ottoman artillery, which had not been heavily engaged during the destruction of the French cavalry, now began to find range. The Wallachians under Mircea, fighting on the Hungarian right flank, held their position against multiple attacks. Mircea the Elder was himself a formidable figure. The ruler of Wallachia had survived years of Ottoman pressure through a combination of military talent and diplomatic agility that made him one of the most experienced commanders on the field. He had no illusions about the Crusade's chances after the French disaster, but he fought with disciplined efficiency because he understood that an orderly withdrawal was worth more than a panicked rout. His cavalry skirmished with Ottoman horsemen along the right flank in a series of sharp, quick engagements that slowed the Ottoman encirclement without committing to a decisive engagement that could not be won. But it could not last. The scale of the Ottoman army was simply too great. As the Janissaries descended from the slope and joined the engagement on the plain, the pressure on the Hungarian lines became irresistible. Units began to give way, not from cowardice, but from arithmetic. There were simply not enough men to hold a line that was being attacked from too many directions at once. And when the Wallachians, watching the French cavalry's catastrophe and calculating the odds, began a withdrawal from the right flank, the Hungarian position became untenable. Sigismund recognized the moment when the battle was lost. He was a pragmatic man, and pragmatism in this context meant understanding that his death would accomplish nothing. The crusade was already over. All that remained was the question of whether the man who had organized it would survive to explain what had gone wrong. He made his way to the Danube with a small escort, pushed through the panicked mass of infantry and non-combatants that was clogging the riverbank, and reached a small Venetian vessel that took him out into the river and downstream towards safety. As the boat moved away from the shore, he could hear, behind him, the sounds of an army dying. Phase 5. The River and the Pursuit. The Danube, in the autumn of 1396, was a killing ground. When the battle on the plain broke, the surviving crusaders had only one direction to run, toward the river. There were boats, some Venetian galleys, some smaller craft, but not remotely enough for the thousands of men now converging on the riverbank in a state of complete panic. The Ottoman cavalry was behind them, fast and merciless, cutting down the stragglers and driving the rest into an ever tighter compression against the water's edge. Men who could not reach a boat had two choices: surrender or drown. Many tried to swim. The Danube in September is cold and deep, and men in chainmail or partial plate armor do not swim well. The river accepted them indifferently. Eyewitness accounts from the aftermath described bodies floating downstream for days, snagged on branches and sandbanks, the detritus of a campaign that had sailed south with such magnificent confidence only weeks before. Those who surrendered were, in some cases, fortunate, in the sense that they lived a little longer. The Ottoman troops took prisoners where they could, particularly when those prisoners were clearly men of rank and ransom value. But many were not taken prisoner. Many were killed where they stood, by cavalry pursuing to fast for discrimination, by infantry still hot with the violence of the battle above. The losses on the riverbank may have been as great as the losses on the slope, though the chaos of the scene makes precise accounting impossible. By the time the pursuit ended, the Danube plain below Nicopolis looked like the aftermath of something beyond ordinary military catastrophe. The scale of the defeat was so complete that it staggered even the men who had inflicted it. But the worst was still to come. Character 4. The Morning After. The morning of September 26, 1396, broke over a different world. Nicopolis itself surrendered to Bayezid without further resistance. The garrison had watched the Crusade's destruction from the walls, had seen the river fill with bodies and the Ottoman banners rise over the plain, and had drawn the obvious conclusion: there was nothing to be gained by further resistance. The town opened its gates, and the Ottoman flag went up over the fortress that the Crusaders had spent 2 weeks failing to take. The reckoning of the dead began, and it was appalling. The crusading army had perhaps 16,000 men at the start of the battle. Of those, somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 were killed, on the slope, on the plain, in the river, in the pursuit. These numbers carry the particular horror of imprecision. The chroniclers who recorded them were working from estimates from the counts made by Ottoman soldiers who were themselves overwhelmed by the scale of what they were counting. What is clear is that the crusade was not merely defeated, it was annihilated. The prisoners presented Bayezid with a problem. He had several thousand of them, a mixture of common soldiers and men of rank, the latter valuable for ransom, the former less so. The massacre of the garrison at Rahova, which had occurred weeks earlier during the Crusade's march south, had not been forgotten. Bayezid was told of it. Whether this influenced what happened next is a matter of historical debate, but what happened next is not. Bayezid ordered the mass execution of the common prisoners. The killing took most of the morning. The prisoners were brought forward in groups and beheaded beside the river, there bodies pushed into the water. Ottoman chroniclers estimated the number at 1,000. Western sources, typically prone to exaggeration in recording Ottoman cruelty, set figures much higher. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere uncertain. But even the conservative estimate makes this one of the largest battlefield executions in medieval history. John of Nevers watched. He had been placed in a position where he could not avoid watching, positioned, some accounts suggest, deliberately by Bayezid, who wanted the most prominent surviving Crusader commander to understand the full dimensions of what had just happened. Nevers, who had feasted the night before and spoken of glory, stood in chains on the bank of the Danube and watched his common soldiers die by the hundred. He was 24 years old. He would live another 40 years, eventually becoming Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful men in Europe. He never forgot what he saw at Nicopolis. The knights of rank were spared for ransom negotiations. This was a purely commercial decision. Bayezid knew their families would pay enormous sums for their return, and enormous sums were always welcome. The negotiations would take months, and the ransoms, when finally agreed, would strip several noble houses of funds that took years to restore. But the men came home. Most of them, eventually, came home. Sigismund did not. He was already gone, carried downstream on a Venetian galley, watching the shoreline recede and the smoke rising from the vicinity of the battlefield. He reached Constantinople eventually, and from there made the long journey back to Buda, back to his kingdom, back to the impossible task of explaining to the rest of Europe what had happened on the Danube plain. The battlefield itself, in the days after the battle, was a place of terrible silence. The bodies had not all been buried. The scale made full burial impractical, and the Danube carried its grim cargo downstream for days. The horses that had survived the battle roamed the plain, riderless, cropping the autumn grass between the fallen. The weapons and armor that had been discarded or stripped from the dead lay scattered across the slope where the French cavalry had made its final charge, already beginning to rust in the morning dew. The banners of France and Burgundy and Hungary lay in the mud where they had fallen. No one came to collect them. No one, in those first days, seemed to know quite how to begin absorbing the reality of what had occurred. The last great crusade had lasted approximately 45 days from the army's departure from Buda to its destruction at Nicopolis. In that time, it had accomplished nothing except the sacking of Rahova and the revelation of how completely European chivalric culture was unprepared for the kind of war the Ottomans fought. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. And it was only the beginning of what it meant. Character 5. The World. Nicopolis made. The news traveled faster than any army. Within weeks, every court in Europe knew the outline of what had happened at Nicopolis. The crusade had charged uphill against prepared Ottoman positions, been surrounded, and been destroyed. The ransomed survivors brought the details, adding texture and horror to the skeleton of the story that rumor had already distributed. And in city after city, in castle halls and monastery scriptoriums and royal throne rooms, the same questions were being asked. How? How had an army that size, that well-equipped, that confidently assembled, been so thoroughly annihilated?
The answers were uncomfortable, and different constituencies drew different lessons. In France, the disaster produced a kind of stunned mourning, followed by an extended refusal to accept its full implications. The blame was distributed variously to bad luck, to treachery, to the failure of Allied contingents to support the French advance. Any explanation that avoided the most obvious one which was that the tactical approach of the French knights had been catastrophically wrong. The honor of the fallen demanded that their deaths be attributed to overwhelming numbers and fortune's cruelty, not to the predictability of their own tactics. This cultural defensiveness would have consequences. It would be another 2 decades before French military thinking began to seriously incorporate the lessons that Nicopolis should have taught immediately. For Sigismund, the aftermath was a long and painful education. He had known before the battle what was wrong, and his knowledge had been useless. The experience sharpened him as a ruler and a strategist. In the years following Nicopolis, he would develop a more sophisticated approach to the Ottoman problem, less dependent on single great battles, more focused on fortification, economic attrition, and the patient accumulation of diplomatic relationships.
He would eventually become Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most consequential rulers of the early 15th century. But Nicopolis never left him. The memory of watching the French charge from his position on the plain, knowing what would happen and being unable to stop it, remained with him as a kind of permanent wound. For the Ottoman Empire, Nicopolis was less a turning point than a confirmation. Bayezid had already known that the crusading mechanism was broken, that European kingdoms could not sustain the cooperation required for effective joint military operations over any significant period of time. Nicopolis proved it definitively. After the battle, there would be no serious crusading offensive against the Ottomans for a generation. The road into the Balkans, into Hungary, toward Vienna and at the heart of Europe, lay open. Bayezid did not immediately march all the way through it. He had other threats to manage, not least the rising power of Timur in the east, which would eventually produce its own catastrophic battle at Ankara in 1402. But the strategic reality was clear. The Christian states of Europe had lost the initiative, and they would not regain it for a very long time. For Constantinople, Nicopolis sealed a fate that had been approaching for decades. The siege that Bayezid had temporarily lifted to march to Nicopolis resumed after the battle, and tightened further in the following years. The city that had survived 1,000 years of attack would hold out for another half-century, partly through the disruption caused by Timur's defeat of Bayezid, which bought several decades of Ottoman internal conflict. But the fundamental reality was established at Nicopolis. Constantinople was isolated. No crusading army would come to save it. When Mehmed II finally broke through its walls in 1453, he was completing a process that the battle on the Danube plain had made all but inevitable. The broader transformation in European warfare that Nicopolis both expressed and accelerated is harder to measure, but equally significant. The battle was not the first time that heavy cavalry had been defeated by prepared infantry positions. The longbowmen at Crusade in 1346 had demonstrated that lesson already, as had the Swiss pikemen in multiple engagements. But Nicopolis was the most spectacular and complete demonstration yet that the age of the cavalry charge as a decisive strategic instrument was ending. The world was changing. Gunpowder was arriving. The massive mounted knight, the great symbol of medieval military power, was becoming obsolescent. Nicopolis showed, in the most brutal possible terms, what happened when an army built around an obsolescent weapon encountered an enemy who had thought carefully about how to defeat it. The ironies of Nicopolis are numerous and instructive. The Crusaders had assembled the largest Christian military expedition in decades, drawn from the finest military traditions in Europe, blessed by the papacy, financed by the wealthiest kingdoms on the continent. They had everything except the one thing they needed, which was a realistic assessment of what they were facing. Bayezid, meanwhile, had everything the Crusaders lacked: accurate intelligence, a prepared position, tactical patience, and the institutional confidence of an army that had been winning consistently for decades. He did not need to be lucky. He needed only to be himself. The ransom negotiations that followed the battle dragged on for months and consumed resources that several noble families would not recover from for years. The total sum paid for the release of the captured French knights has been estimated at 200,000 gold ducats, a figure that, in context, represented more than the annual income of several smaller European kingdoms. Bayezid used part of the money to fund further campaigning. He used part of it to build a mosque at Bursa. He appears to have found the entire transaction entirely satisfying. John of Navarre eventually returned from captivity, his ransom paid after months of negotiation. He became Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, and in that role he became one of the most influential figures in early 15th century European politics. A founder of the Order of the Golden Fleece, a patron of the arts, a man whose court was the most brilliant in Northern Europe. He never went on another crusade. He was asked. Multiple times, across decades, he was asked to lead or support crusading expeditions against the Ottomans. He declined, always politely, always with apparently good reasons. But those who knew him well said that the real reason was simpler and older than any political calculation. It was what he had seen on the bank of the Danube on the morning of September 26, 1396. The bodies in the river, the sound of the executions, the smoke rising over the plain where the flower of French chivalry had charged uphill into the certainty of its own destruction. Some lessons are learned only once. Some mornings stay with a man forever. Today, Nicopolis is a small Bulgarian town called Nicopol, sitting quietly on a bluff above the Danube. The plain below, where the battle was fought, is farmland now, flat green fields stretching toward the river, crossed by a road that carries trucks instead of knights, a road that shows no sign of what happened here 6¼ centuries ago. The fortress walls are partially standing, weathered to the color of old bone. Tourists come sometimes, summer visitors who stand on the bluff and look out over the Danube and try to imagine the scene that unfolded here. The banners, the charging horses, the wall of sound rolling up from the plain. It is difficult to imagine. The silence is too complete. The fields are too ordinary. The river moves past exactly as it moved past on the morning of September 26, 1396, indifferent and unhurried, carrying no trace of what it once carried. But the questions that Nicopolis raises are not historical artifacts. They are alive. They are with us now, dressed in different clothes but recognizable beneath them. What happens when certainty defeats strategy? When pride defeats prudence? When an army's absolute confidence in its own method blinds it to an enemy who has studied that method and built a trap around it? The crusaders at Nicopolis were brave men. Many of them were brilliant men. They had resources, training, motivation, and the blessing of the most powerful institution in the Western world. They had everything, except the one thing that would have saved them: the humility to admit that they might not know everything about how to fight. Bayezid knew. He had watched. He had studied. He had waited. And when the moment came, he did not need bravery or brilliance or divine blessing. He needed only patience. He needed only to let the crusaders be exactly who they were. The Thunderbolt struck at Nicopolis, and what it struck was not merely an army. It was an idea. The idea that faith and courage and the finest armor in the world were sufficient protection against an enemy who had thought longer and more carefully about how to win. That idea died on the slope above Nicopolis, along with 10,000 men who had believed in it completely. It has never fully recovered. Centuries later, the plain is quiet. The Danube flows on. The fields grow green and golden with the turning of the seasons, and the sky above the Bulgarian plains cycles through its endless changes: gray, gold, deep blue, gray again. And the river carries everything south toward the sea, carrying nothing and forgetting nothing, the way rivers do. The last great crusade charged uphill into the morning of September 25, 1396, banners streaming, lances couched, certain of victory, and the mountain swallowed it whole.